Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Rarer Than Gold by Holly Newman. Narrated by Chris Macdonnell. 1. "Come in," called out Sir James Branstoke at the light knock on the estate-room door. He exchanged puzzled looks with his new bride, Lady Cecilia Hawkstrom Wadley Branstoke, at the interruption. They had adjourned to the estate-room after breakfast, and were seated across from each other, discussing the improvements necessary to bring Summerworth Park back to a profitable state. As far as their friends in London knew, they had left on their honeymoon trip to the Highlands immediately following their wedding at one of the Wren chapels in London 4 weeks ago. Instead, they'd travelled down to Kent, south of Maidstone, to Summerworth Park, an estate at the edge of the South Downs that Sir James recently purchased from his cousin, the new Earl of Marchant. The Earl's elder brother and father, between them, had devastated the family fortune, and it was the task of the second son, now Earl, to set the family fortunes to right as best he might do, in order to provide for his orphaned twin half-sisters, Eugenia and Augusta. The first thing he did was to find purchasers for his unentailed properties. The Summerworth Park Georgian manor and properties came to him from his mother. As Sir James's mother and the Earl's mother had been sisters, he thought it fitting that the property stay within his family, so he'd approached James to buy the estate. Sir James had been happy to acquire the property, for he had fond memories of visiting the estate as a child. Unfortunately, the years and the deprivations of the old Earl had seen the estate fall into disrepair. He now understood why his cousin had sold it to him for a song. Luckily, his new wife had been delighted with the opportunity and the challenge of bringing the estate around, and it was she who decided she'd rather spend time on the estate versus travelling north for a honeymoon. There would be other occasions for trips. He enjoyed sitting in the estate-room with his new bride in the mornings, while he projected an image of a gentleman unruffled and perpetually at his leisure. This was the first time in a long while that he felt as relaxed as his public mien suggested. As Cecilia looked at her writing notes, her pale blonde hair glowed golden in the morning sun streaming into the room. She was a prize he'd never thought to have, a jewel rarer than gold, a woman of intellect, humour, determination, loyalty, and love. And he owned he would never have done more than indulge in a trifling flirt with her if she hadn't, quite unwittingly, snubbed him at Lady Amblethorpe's musicale, and he, like a hound to a scent, had become determined to find out why. He smiled wryly at the merry and sometimes frightening chase she'd led him on. "Excuse me, Sir James, your ladyship," said Coggins, the Summerworth Park butler. "This letter just came for you from Folkestone." "Ah, good, Coggins," James said, standing up and extending his hand to take the letter from the silver tray the butler carried. Cecilia looked up at her husband. "Do you think it is in response to those inquiries you sent out?" she asked, as the door closed behind Coggins. He pulled a letter-opener from his desk drawer to pry the wax seal off the folded paper. "I hope so." So busy had the Branstokes been with their new property, they had not had an opportunity to meet many other families in their vicinity, save for the vicar, Septimus Jones, and his wife, a woman of indeterminate age who delighted in gossip. When the vicar and his wife came for tea shortly after they had arrived in the neighbourhood, Mrs. Jones whispered to Lady Branstoke about the sad situation with Lord and Lady Aldrich at Bartlett Hall, their nearest neighbouring estate. "Baron Aldrich married a woman from trade," she disclosed. Mrs. Jones smoothed the fine blue cambric fabric of her skirts and admitted the Aldriches appeared content with their match, leastwise from what she saw at Sunday services. "However," she continued, "Lord Aldrich went away 3 weeks ago, hasn't returned, nor has anyone heard from him." Lamentably, the vicar's wife confided, the other prominent family, the Inglewoods of Inglewood Grange, looked down their noses at Lady Aldrich, as she was not to the manor born. "Now, Miranda," warned the vicar severely when he realized his wife was indulging in gossip, "Well, Septimus, you know they are acting quite odious," she'd said primly. "Even after you cautioned them against that unchristian attitude, they have continued to snub the Aldriches." Cecilia's late husband had been in trade. Consequently, she knew how badly the Tantor treated a person coming from that economic stratus. Though she was born the granddaughter of a duke and the daughter of a baron, as the wife of a merchant she was no one. Then when her husband died, miraculously she became a someone again in the eyes of the Tantor. Cecilia could not bear that hypocrisy, and her heart bled for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar neither fish nor fowl situation. Upon the departure of the vicar and his wife, she immediately determined to make Lady Aldrich's acquaintance, and she was glad she had. The women became fast friends, visiting back and forth daily. Cecilia took it as her personal challenge to keep Lady Aldrich's spirits up during the continued absence of her husband, and she'd harried James to make discreet inquiries as to his location and the reason for his continued absence. James had some acquaintance with the missing baron, and knew him to be a bit of a loose screw, and therefore did not see the need for the inquiries his wife requested. However, newly married as they were, he indulged his beautiful wife and set the wheels in motion to learn more, for her peace of mind. He scanned the letter's contents, a frown pulling his dark brows together. He sighed deeply as he shook his head. He had to admit his wife had excellent instincts. "A nasty business all around," he murmured. "What is it, James?" "It's from George Pollock, the magistrate in the Folkestone area. He said up the coast, between Folkestone and Dover, a carriage tumbled over a cliff. He believes the coach belonged to Lord Aldrich." "What?" She dropped her quill on the paper before her, ink blots splattering across the desk and her careful notes. She quickly grabbed another piece of paper to blot up wet ink. James looked up from the letter. "Didn't you tell me Aldrich left on horseback?" "That is what Eleanor said," she responded as she frowned down at the ink mess. "It was just the coach?" she asked distractedly as she searched for something else to clean up the ink. She was loath to use her lace-edged handkerchief. Seeing her dilemma, James handed her his handkerchief, then looked down at the paper again. "This is interesting. Pollock tells me they found no bodies at the location, yet he says he assumes Lord Aldrich is dead. He is, however, investigating further, but says that is not general knowledge. He has written directly to Lady Aldrich to inform her Lord Aldrich is dead." "Dead?" The colour drained from Cecilia's face. "Oh, no. Poor Eleanor." She reached out, silently requesting to read the letter. James passed it to her. Cecilia skimmed the missive, her expression stricken when she looked up at her husband again. "This is disastrous. Eleanor has no one, James. Her mother is deceased, and her father is presently away on business in Scotland. She will be quite shattered. What a way to deliver the news, so matter-of-factly, so callously," she said. "Magistrates must deal in facts, Cecilia," her husband reminded her, though he wondered how Mr. Pollock assumed death without proof. "I know," she conceded petulantly, "but there is not a whit of sympathy or regret in this letter. I hope what he sent to Eleanor had some bit of softness or regret. I must go see her immediately, James," she said, rising to her feet. She turned to quit the room. James forestalled her with a light touch. "We'll go together, my love," he said. There was much not stated in Mr. Pollock's letter, and that fact troubled him, and knowing his wife, he knew she would soon tumble to that observation as well, and would want to look for answers. He crossed to the bell-pull to ring for Coggins. In just over 20 minutes, James was driving them to Bartlett Hall. Cecilia had harried their staff to hurry. She had sent Coggins to order a groom to harness the curricle with Sir James's greys and bring it around to the manor's front. She had sent the downstairs maid, previously employed in dusting the hall, to find Sarah, her maid, and send her to her while she ran up the stairs to her dressing-room. Minutes later, Sarah found her blindly yanking on the ribbons at the back of the peach and cream-striped morning gown she'd donned before she'd gone down to breakfast. "Here, your ladyship, leave off doing that, lest you have it in knots," Sarah remonstrated. "I'm in a hurry," Cecilia returned, pulling on the ribbon again. Sarah pushed her hands out of the way and untangled the mess Cecilia had made. "Now, what has you in such a bother?" "We have just had word that Lord Aldrich might be dead. We are going immediately to Bartlett Hall." "Dead, you say?" Sarah questioned as she pulled the dress over Cecilia's head. "Did you know you have ink spots on this dress?" "Yes and yes," Cecilia said impatiently. "Please fetch me the blue dress with the lace at the collar and cuffs." Sarah laid the ruined morning gown across a chair by the window, then crossed to the armoire to pull out the blue gown. "This is a lovely dress, my lady. It goes beautifully with your eyes." "Bother about me. Lady Aldrich is bound to be overwrought." "I am hoping it is a calming hue," Cecilia said. "Definitely. Turn around, please, my lady, so that I can get these tapes. I'll want my kid half-boots, a vial of lavender water, and some extra handkerchiefs," Cecilia decided. "Immediately," Sarah replied. "I worry for Eleanor," Cecilia told her husband as he tooled his matched greys down the drive toward Bartlett Hall. "She has seemed a very level-headed young woman in the few times I have spoken with her," he said absently as he concentrated on his horses. He frowned at them. They hadn't been driven in a while and were restive. He must remind Romley to exercise them in harness and without. "Oh, she is," his wife said, pulling him out of contemplation on his horses, "which is why I believe we get on so marvellously. Though hers was an arranged marriage of convenience, she has fallen in love with her husband. This will devastate her, as it would me if I lost you," she said on a drawn-out sigh. James glanced down at her and shifted the reins into one hand to reach over to squeeze her hands where they lay in her lap. He privately acknowledged the same sentiment as he remembered his emotions when he'd realized she'd been abducted. That was 5 weeks ago. Sometimes when he awoke in the night with his heart racing, it seemed like yesterday. The distance between Summerworth Park and Bartlett Hall was slightly more than a mile if one walked across the fields. However, by carriage it exceeded 2 miles along a pleasant lane with a vista of the rolling downs to the east. Wildflowers bloomed along the road and across the meadows. "I will be interested to see the letter Mr. Pollock sent Lady Aldrich. I wonder if it contains more information than mine did," James said some minutes later as they turned down a tree-lined lane that would bring them to Bartlett Hall. Cecilia looked up at him. What more information should the letter have contained? "It's curious that he mentioned only the carriage as being at the bottom of the cliff. I doubt Aldrich drove a carriage without a horse or groom," he said. "Oh," Cecilia considered this observation. She frowned. "Could they all have been carried out to sea?" "The people, yes, I suppose. However, a horse or horses in harness would have stayed with the carriage." Cecilia cocked her head. "That's true, and yet Mr. Pollock's letter gives no details. I wonder what kind of carriage it was." "Ha, excellent point. I had been assuming a travelling carriage. However, it could have been a smaller vehicle, like a tilbury. And in that instance there may not be a body, for it would have tumbled out of the equipage and therefore been washed out to sea." "Yes, but that still leaves the question of the horse, and that is why I am curious if Lady Aldrich will show us her letter," James said. "She will," Cecilia said. "I'll insist," she added, her brows pulling together in a frown. Sir James, remembering how they met and Cecilia's fierce determination to find answers to her late husband's death, looked at his bride and smiled. Unlike Summerworth Park, Bartlett Hall revealed none of the deprivations a house might otherwise show from an impecunious owner. It was a neat 9-bay manor house built of Flemish yellow brick, edged and banded with Kentish blue-grey ragstone. Deep green ivy climbed one corner of the building and framed an upper-story window. The roof was of dark grey slate. As James swung the carriage around the drive before the house, Cecilia was surprised that neither a footman nor groom nor a stable lad ran up to greet them and to take their carriage. Cecilia could hear Eleanor crying through the open library windows to the right of the centrally placed door. She tightly gripped her reticule with its vial of lavender water and extra handkerchiefs, glad she had thought to bring the items. James handed Cecilia down from the carriage. "Are you sure you are ready for this?" he asked. "Yes," she said decisively as she gathered her mantle of determination about her. "Take the carriage round to the stable-yard, and then join me in the house." "As you wish," he said, slight doubt colouring his voice as he looked up at the open window. Cecilia hugged his arm, then pushed him on his way as she turned to walk toward the manor. She sharply rapped the door-knocker. When no one immediately answered, she tried the door-latch. It was not locked, so she pushed the door open. She stood for a moment in the hallway, her eyes readjusting to the dimmer light inside after the bright light outdoors. How odd! There were no servants immediately around. Besides Eleanor's sobbing, she now heard from the library a man's voice. Had Mr. Pollock come in person after all to give her the news of her husband's death? She walked toward the library's double doors. To her surprise, Cecilia heard the man asking Eleanor about her husband's papers. Cecilia did not know what the stranger could want, but she deemed pestering a woman who had just learned she had lost her husband highly irregular and grossly rude. Curious and annoyed, she pushed open the library door. Lady Aldrich sat on a green and cream damask-covered sofa near the fireplace, her body turned away from the gentleman standing before her, her dark hair in disarray, her face buried in her arms. It was clear she was crying. That fact ratcheted up Cecilia's dissatisfaction with the man. The gentleman was well-favoured in appearance, tall and most likely athletic, judging by how he held himself. When he turned in her direction, Cecilia noted his well-made clothing and the gloss on his boots. He was not a tulip of the temps, nor was he a dandy. However, he was neither a lawyer nor a clerk. She scowled. "This is a private matter," the man said, his fair brows pulling together. She looked him up and down. "Yes," Cecilia said in her haughtiest manner. She understood the power of the cut direct expression and used it on the gentleman. She was pleased to see him discomfited. "The death of Lord Aldrich is a private matter," she continued in a softer tone. "I suggest you leave." She brushed past him and sat next to Eleanor, pulling her around to cry on her shoulder. I know," she said soothingly while rubbing Eleanor's back. "James and I are here for you." Eleanor lifted her head slightly to look at Cecilia. "How?" she hiccuped. "How did you know?" "James has been making inquiries," she whispered, as she pulled a fresh handkerchief from her reticule and blotted Eleanor's cheeks. This started Eleanor crying harder. Cecilia took her sodden handkerchief from her and put the fresh one in her hand. "Madame, I do not know who you are, but it is of national importance that I speak with Lady Aldrich in private. She may have information that is vital for the government," the man said, recovering from her initial presence. He took a step closer, flailing his arms for emphasis. Cecilia glared up at him. "Nor do I know who you are." Anger vibrated in her voice and posture. "I do know Lady Aldrich," she continued, "and I also know that what she doesn't need right now is a buffoon asking questions at her highest moment of grief. You were a caper-witted idiot to come here now, of all times, and make demands. Get out." "Cecilia, is there a problem?" James calmly asked from the doorway, his demeanour not revealing any of the rancour he felt, first toward the servants he encountered in the servants' hall, and now toward the puffed-up imbecile haranguing his wife and Lady Aldrich. "Yes," Cecilia replied. This nodcock insists he speak with Eleanor. When I came in, he was positively hounding her about some papers he thinks Lord Aldrich has. You can see she is in no condition to answer his questions, let alone think clearly if she could. Please get him out of here." Twin red flags of colour flared on Cecilia's cheeks, and her blue eyes turned their darkest blue, as they were wont to do when she was upset. James studied the well-set-up gentleman before him with patent disapproval. Military, he supposed. "Let's leave my wife to support and calm Lady Aldrich as best she can," he told the man in the voice he'd once used on his junior officers. He stepped aside to pointedly indicate the gentleman should precede him out the door. The man took a step forward, then stopped. "Who are you? You might be here for the same purpose as I am," he protested, his broad brow furrowing, his lower lip thrust forward in the manner of a child's pout. James sighed. "I have no idea what your purpose is. I am Sir James Branstoke, and the fair-haired woman you have riled is my wife, Lady Branstoke, granddaughter of the Duke of Houghton. Now come, Lieutenant." "Captain," corrected the gentleman stiffly, raising his chin to look down his aquiline nose at Branstoke. His manner amused James. "My apologies, Captain," he said. "Now, I insist we leave the women in peace. We can adjourn to the blue parlour I know to be across the hall here, and see if we can rouse the staff from their mourning to offer us refreshments." The captain frowned, but this time did as James requested. James quietly shut the library door after them. The captain turned to look at him. "How did you know?" he asked. "Know what?" James said as they crossed the broad entry hall. "That you were military?" "Yes." "Your stance," he returned simply. "Damn and blast it," the man said viciously. James smiled, his eyes hooded. "I take it you were trying to conceal your military association?" James asked as he pushed open the parlour doors. "It is not in the best interest of the mission for me to be identified as a member of the military." "And why is that?" James asked languidly as he went to the bell-pull to summon a servant to them. "That, sir, is confidential," the man answered stiffly. James studied the man. He had a firm chin and dimples in his cheeks, even when he didn't smile. He reminded James of someone. "And is knowing your name confidential as well?" he asked as he sat in a chair by the window, his face in shadows, while the guests stood in bright light. "I warn you, if you say your name is confidential, then I should say you were the villain here, and will notify authorities that you have been behaving suspiciously to Lady Aldrich." The man compressed his lips in a tight line. "Melville. Captain Andrew Melville." "Ah," James said, the dimples and chin coalescing into another face in his mind. "Any relationship to Lady Blessingame?" "She is my sister," he reluctantly replied. "She is an intelligent woman, and from what I understand she has served the Crown well." The door to the parlour opened. "Mr. Thomas," James said, "if you would be so kind, some brandy for us, and then please see that your mistress and my wife receive refreshments in the library as well." Earlier, when James had driven the curricle around to the stable, he'd been irritated at the absence of staff. He'd tied his horses off at the gate and come in the house by the back servants' entry, where he found all the staff gathered in the servants' hall crying, commiserating, or wringing their hands, wondering what was to become of them. James had introduced himself and sternly reminded them of their obligation to their mistress. It was she who would determine what would happen to them, and it was she they should care for. They quickly scattered, save for the butler, who quietly introduced himself as Roland Thomas. He apologized for himself and the staff and thanked James for his arrival and his reminder. Now that worthy merely bowed and murmured acquiescence. He went to a cabinet that sat under a large landscape painting of an old oak tree with a mill in the background. From inside he pulled out a decanter with 2 glasses, placed them on a small silver tray on top of the cabinet, then brought them over to where James sat. He then bowed himself out of the room. James poured out 2 glasses of brandy, handed one to Melville, and then gestured for Captain Melville to sit as he asked, "Did you bring Lady Aldrich the news of the probable death of Baron Aldrich?" Captain Melville moved toward the chair nearest James. "No, though it appeared she had recently learned that news that is distressing to me as well." He started to sit, then straightened and looked at James. "What do you mean by probable death?" James lifted a shoulder in an elegant shrug. "It is my understanding there is no body or bodies." He sniffed the brandy. The rich aroma suggested smuggled goods. His sip confirmed his suspicion. He smiled slightly as he set the glass on the gilt, bronze and ormolu decorated table at his side. "But if you were not aware of his death," he continued, "then why are you here when Lord Aldrich is away? What do you want of Lady Aldrich?" "That I cannot tell you. I can only say it is of national importance," Melville said lugubriously. "If you won't say, then I cannot help you," James said, "and I very much doubt Lady Aldrich can either." The captain ran his hand through his dusky blonde hair. "If I could but look through his desk," he said plaintively. James raised one dark brow in haughty disdain. "No, that is not possible. For one, I expect Lady Aldrich and my wife are to be in there for some time. For another," he spread his hands before him, "I don't trust you." Melville gaped at James. But, you have displayed a marked want of good manners. Your methods are crude and not at all good ton. I believe it would mortify your sister. I suggest you finish your drink, for you are leaving now," James said calmly. The captain bristled and looked like he wanted to protest further. However, under the circumstances, there was nothing more he could say. He rose from his chair and looked blackly at James as he stalked out of the room and took his hat from a waiting footman. James watched him go. His eyes narrowed as he considered the man and what his errand could be. That he was Lady Blessingham's brother and was reticent in manner inclined James to think the young man worked clandestinely, as had Lady Blessingham's late husband, and at one time Lady Blessingham herself. Interesting. What could he want from Aldrich? The Baron was a likeable enough fellow, his intellect not above average. Though he did not know him well, he understood someone always talked him into schemes and games his peers entered into, thus his need this year to take a wife with funds. He tossed off the rest of his brandy, stood up, turning to the window. He saw a stable lad bring a horse around for the captain, and he watched the man ride down the lane he and Cecilia had arrived on. When he was out of sight, James walked out of the room and crossed the hall back to the library. He doubted they had seen the last of Captain Melville. 2. Outside the library hovered the butler and two women, one of whom Branstoke judged to be the housekeeper by her dark, sombre attire and chatelaine, and the other an East Indian woman draped in a cream-coloured sari, banded in dark brown and yellow. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said. "Oh!" the housekeeper exclaimed as they all stepped back from eavesdropping. "Mrs. Wembley, have a bedchamber made up for Lady Branstoke and me. Under the circumstances, we will stay here the night. I'll write a note that one of the grooms can take to Summerworth Park to apprise them and arrange for my valet and her lady's maid to join us." "Yes, Sir James." The woman bobbed a curtsy. "Lady Branstoke and I will endeavour to see that Lady Aldrich retires to her chambers. She is understandably overwrought. I trust you have some laudanum to help her sleep." It was the tiny Indian woman who answered. "Yes, Sahib. I go up, fix Mem Sab's room and get medicine," she said in a heavily accented sing-song voice, her dark brown eyes liquid with unshed tears as she looked up at him. "Excellent." He opened the library door and went inside. Lady Aldrich reclined on the sofa, her feet drawn up and covered with a burnt-orange shawl, the fringe brushing the floor. She no longer cried, though her face bore the imprint of her tears, her skin pale and blotchy. She clutched a handkerchief in her hand. Cecilia had pulled up an upholstered chair next to Lady Aldrich, her expression the saddest Sir James could ever recall seeing on his wife. She looked up at him. James gave her a consoling nod. "I have gotten rid of the gentleman plaguing Lady Aldrich. However, I don't—"
Sample complete. Ready to continue?